My name is Amanda Cole, and I'm 38 years old. I flew 8 hours to be here today, holding a gift I had spent weeks preparing, hoping maybe, just maybe, this anniversary would be different. I didn't expect warmth or applause, but I expected to at least be allowed through the door. Instead, the moment I stepped onto the front steps, everything I'd tried to rebuild collapsed in one breath. My sister looked me straight in the eye, her expression carved out of ice, and told me I wasn't family anymore. No hesitation, no shame. Just a clean cut meant to slice through every attempt I'd ever made to stay connected. And behind her, the two people who raised me stood in perfect silence, not even blinking, as if her words were simply true. As if 8 hours of travel, years of effort, and every part of me that still believed in this family meant absolutely nothing. I didn't shout. I didn't plead. I didn't even ask why, because the answer was already written on their faces. I had been erased long before this moment. Today was just the first time they said it out loud. So I turned around. I walked back down those steps with the gift still in my hands and something heavier settling in my chest. They thought shutting the door would be the end of it. They didn't know what I carried with me, or how quickly everything they built could crack. 1 hour later, the celebration behind that door would unravel in ways none of them were prepared for. Before I tell you what he said, and what happened after I walked out, tell me, what time is it for you right now? And where are you watching from? I'm curious to see how far this story will travel. Life inside the Cole family never felt as smooth as the image on our holiday cards. My parents owned Cole Event Group, a business that ran wedding venues and conference centers across Colorado. In public, they were the polished couple giving speeches about entrepreneurship and community. At home, the unwritten rule was simple: the closer you were to the business, the more you mattered. My older sister lived in that center circle. She tagged along to site visits, listened in on calls with vendors, and talked about the brand as if it were a person. I brought home strong report cards and kept the house running, yet faded into the background whenever the company came up. Teachers and counselors said I had a talent for numbers and should consider accounting or finance. My parents nodded and asked how I planned to use those skills for the family. Every strength I had was measured by how well it could be folded into Cole Event Group. When I asked about doing something on my own, the answer stayed the same. Real success meant feeding the business that carried our name. At 20, I cleared my schedule for a weekend retreat at a mountain lodge that was supposed to include staff and family. I drove to the meeting point and found an empty lot and a text saying the group had left the night before because plans had changed. Later, when the company opened a flagship downtown venue with a ribbon-cutting and press coverage, I learned about it from a news article showing my parents and my sister under the marquee. My name had never been on the guest list, so I built a life that did not depend on their invitations. I went to school for accounting, passed my exams, and started a small practice handling books for local businesses. My parents called it a side gig and repeated that real impact came from being part of something bigger, by which they meant their company, not mine. The only time my work seemed useful to them was when their own system started to strain. A senior accountant at Cole Event Group quit suddenly, and my dad called asking if I could step in for a short stretch. He pitched it as a chance to prove myself inside the business. I hesitated, then agreed. Part of me still wanted to believe there was space for me that did not require becoming a copy of my sister. From the inside, the numbers did not match the brochures. Payroll reports landed on my desk with odd gaps. Overtime hours appeared on initial drafts and vanished from final versions. Time cards were edited after events, with notes urging staff to clock out before teardown was finished. When I asked about the adjustments, I was told it was industry standard, and that I was turning routine corrections into something bigger than they were. Then I reviewed the relief grants the company had received during the pandemic and the unstable years that followed. On paper, the funds were labeled as support for keeping staff employed and covering essential costs. In the ledger, transfers peeled off into side accounts that paid for cosmetic renovations, executive travel, and perks that never appeared on documentation tied to the grants. I brought a summary of what I had found to a management meeting. The explanation I got was polished: timing issues, internal reallocations, nothing improper. But the room went still in a way I could not ignore. After that, conversation shifted when I entered an office. Emails that once asked for my input started arriving without my name on them. I was still introduced as family helping out, yet I could feel the distance widening with every polite smile. That was when I began quietly saving copies of the documents I handled: payroll summaries, internal memos, grant reports, anything that showed how money and hours really moved. I told myself it was a precaution, something any careful accountant would do if they sensed trouble. Eventually, the temporary assignment ended with brief thanks and a note about restructuring the finance team. I went back to my cramped office, to clients who appreciated hard questions, and treated the whole experience as another reminder of how far I stood from the center of the coal world. A few days after returning to my routine, the invitation arrived: formal lettering, embossed edges, and a tone so polished it felt more like a press release than a message from my own parents. Their anniversary celebration had always been a spectacle, and this year's event seemed designed to be even grander. I held the card for a long moment before setting it on my desk, wondering if attending would change anything or simply confirm what I already knew. Silence didn't give me an answer, but something in me refused to stay absent again. The morning of my flight, I packed a small bag, choosing items with practical precision, as if order could soften the uncertainty ahead. Jason drove me to the airport with a reassuring calm that contrasted with the knot tightening in my chest. I moved through security, boarded my flight, and settled into a window seat. The hours stretched with a slow heaviness, filled with shifting turbulence and the muted hum of strangers around me. I kept my mind focused on the possibility, thin as it was, that showing up might open a door that had been shut for years. When the plane touched down, the sharp air of the city met me with a familiar bite. I collected my luggage and stepped into a rideshare, watching the passing scenery and feeling memories of childhood landmarks pull at me like threads. Each neighborhood carried echoes of weekends spent organizing files for the business or being drafted into preparations for events that felt more like obligations than celebrations. Still, I wondered if this time would feel different. The venue hosting the anniversary stood near the edge of a busy district, its entrance framed by clean lines and warm lights. Guests filtered in, dressed with deliberate elegance, carrying the confidence of people who believed they belonged. I paused near the walkway, holding the small wrapped gift I had chosen. A gesture meant more for myself than anyone else. My palms felt damp, though my expression remained steady. As I stepped closer to the entrance, movement at the doorway shifted. My sister emerged with an authority that matched the role she had grown into. Without hesitation, she placed herself in my path, her posture firm and unyielding. The tone she used carried the kind of finality that could split stone. Behind her, two familiar silhouettes hovered without speaking, their presence rigid and unreadable. Their stillness pressed heavier on me than any accusation. I waited for even a flicker of acknowledgement that they wanted me there. None came. My sister's stance did not soften, and the absence of response from the two people who shaped my childhood settled into the air like dust refusing to fall. In that moment, the polished glow of the venue seemed to sharpen into something brittle. A strange calm spread across me, not acceptance, but clarity. Years of strained conversations and quiet exclusions had led to this silent divide. I realized I could not force my way through a door held shut by people who had already decided where I stood. so I eased my grip on the gift and stepped back. Not a retreat, but a deliberate withdrawal from a space that had never allowed room for me. I turned away without looking back. The walkway behind me felt longer than it had minutes earlier, though my pace remained measured. The event continued behind the glass panels, a gathering built on appearances carefully maintained. I moved through the parking area and toward the street, letting the night absorb the weight that pressed against my ribs. Once I reached the edge of the block, I paused long enough to steady my breathing. The invitation, the flight, the effort, none of it had shifted the dynamic that defined my family. But stepping away carried a different kind of power, one rooted not in resignation, but in reclaiming the ground beneath my own feet. I continued down the sidewalk with a quiet determination forming in my chest. There was no plan yet, only the faint beginning of an intention I could not fully name. But something had tilted, an internal pivot that pointed me toward a choice I had avoided for far too long. The first place I found myself walking toward was a small cafe tucked between two storefronts a few blocks from the venue. It wasn't a conscious choice. My feet simply needed somewhere quiet to land, and the soft glow of the interior pulled me in without effort. I chose a corner table, set my bag down, and wrapped my hands around a cup that cooled faster than I drank it. The room murmured with low conversation, but my mind drifted elsewhere, pulled back into memories I had tried to stack neatly out of sight. For years, I had brushed past the discomfort I felt while handling internal documents for Cole Event Group. At the time, I convinced myself it was inexperience or paranoia. Yet the pages that once passed through my hands carried discrepancies I could not unsee now. Hours trimmed beneath the surface, signatures that fell into place too perfectly, adjustments to grant reports that shifted funds in ways that did not match the original intent. Those details had lingered like faint stains, easy to ignore until light hit them at the right angle. One late afternoon during my months in the accounting office, Monica Alvarez stopped by my desk with a stack of payroll records. She had always maintained a calm exterior, but her eyes revealed more than her tone allowed. As she placed the files down, she hesitated long enough to leave an unspoken warning embedded between the papers. Something was off. She didn't have to say it directly for me to hear it. From that moment, every spreadsheet felt heavier, as though carrying the weight of actions that could not withstand scrutiny. I tried asking questions once, phrasing them carefully and keeping my voice neutral. The response from upper management had been smooth, almost rehearsed, and I remember leaving the meeting with the unsettling sense of having stepped into a room where no one acknowledged the cracks on the walls. Still, the unease stayed with me, pressing at the edges of my thoughts until I eventually saved copies of documents without fully knowing why. Now, sitting in this cafe with its soft yellow light and the hum of strangers around me, that decision no longer felt cautionary. It felt prophetic. The memory of being turned away at the door minutes earlier sharpened everything. Something inside me shifted with a clarity that did not require anger to take form. Their silence had spoken volumes, but my response did not need to mirror their indifference. Instead, I opened my laptop, the familiar weight of it grounding me. The screen glowed to life, and the folder I had hidden years ago waited with a stillness that felt almost deliberate. As I scrolled through the files, each document carried its own quiet testimony. Numbers that didn't align, notes that redirected funds with vague descriptions, patterns that repeated across months. I wasn't searching for certainty. I already had that. I was searching for the right direction to take the truth. A name surfaced in my mind with steady clarity: Alicia Park. I remembered reading one of her investigative pieces months earlier, a well-documented report that unraveled a local company's misuse of relief funding. Her work had been concise, thorough, and free from sensationalism. She focused on facts, not spectacle, and something about that steadiness made her the only person I felt I could trust with what I carried. I drafted a message without embellishment, attaching documents as evidence instead of explanations. My fingers hovered for a beat before pressing send, and when the message disappeared from my screen, a quiet shift settled in my chest. Not triumph, not fear. Just the acceptance that a line had been crossed and could not be uncrossed. Minutes later, a notification appeared. Alicia had responded with a single request for a brief call. I stepped outside, the cold air cutting through the haze that had wrapped around me. During the call, her voice held a measured calm, the kind of steadiness that comes from years of navigating delicate terrain. She asked only what she needed to confirm authenticity and said nothing unnecessary. When she finished reviewing the files, her tone changed. Not shocked, but purposeful. She told me the information was significant, that the patterns were unmistakable, and that she would begin verifying details immediately. When the call ended, I stood still for a moment as the streetlights flickered along the sidewalk. My breath left me in a slow exhale, the decision settling deeper into place. Whatever happened next would unfold beyond the walls of this cafe, beyond my family's reach, and beyond the version of myself that once believed silence was safer than truth. Back at the venue, the celebration had settled into its usual rhythm of polished introductions and curated charm. What happened next didn't unfold all at once. It rippled, small at first, then unmistakable. It began when a guest near the bar lowered his phone with a furrowed brow, glancing around as if verifying the room against something he had just read. Another guest's screen lit up seconds later, followed by the soft chiming of notifications spreading through the hall like an invisible signal. Conversations paused mid-sentence. Laughter thinned, replaced by curious murmurs that grew sharper with every passing moment. The article Alicia had published moved quickly, its headline direct, and its evidence impossible to dismiss. Screens displayed excerpts that traced financial inconsistencies, payroll irregularities, and grant allocations veering far outside permissible boundaries. The pristine glow of the venue lights suddenly seemed to expose more than they softened. I could picture how it unfolded without being there. Guests who had spent years attending Cole events now exchanged looks that carried more caution than admiration. Some held their phones close to their chests, as if the words displayed were too heavy to let others see. Others showed the article openly, pointing to sections that described patterns and dates, with the precision only confirmed documents could provide. As the murmur thickened, attention shifted toward the front of the hall where the hosts stood unaware of the shift beneath them. A guest approached with a rigid posture, showing his screen with a seriousness usually reserved for emergencies. More guests followed, each approaching with a question that carried a sharper edge than the last. The change in atmosphere was undeniable, a social tide turning without hesitation. Within minutes, a cluster of attendees formed around the central table. Some demanded clarification, others simply observed with guarded expressions, their trust wavering. Partnerships built over years of careful networking now felt precarious. Even without raised voices, the sense of pressure must have been unmistakable, a heaviness that pressed against the carefully curated celebration. A few guests stepped aside to make calls, keeping their tone low but their urgency evident. The staff, trained to maintain composure, exchanged glances that revealed cracks in their steadiness. Whispers moved through the room with growing certainty. The allegations were detailed, the documents real, and the situation no longer contained. Then, a new presence entered. The unmistakable figure of a representative from the State Labor Department, identifiable by the badge clipped neatly to a coat. Their arrival shifted the energy sharply. Staff paused their tasks, guests instinctively parted, and several members of the management team moved forward with uneasy smiles. Questions were asked quietly but firmly, and requests for documentation were delivered with the kind of precision that left no space for negotiation. The representative's focus soon turned toward the operations area of the venue. Doors were opened, records retrieved, and a few staff members were led aside for private conversations. While nothing dramatic occurred outwardly, the sense of unraveling was immediate. The event was no longer a celebration, it had become an examination. Guests who had once praised the Cole family's professionalism now stepped back from the unfolding scene. Some collected their coats early, choosing to leave without offering farewells. Others lingered long enough to witness the tension settling into the air, marked by stiff postures and fractured attempts to maintain normalcy. Every movement carried the weight of uncertainty. In another corner, a vendor reviewed the article on a tablet, shaking their head slowly before packing up portions of their setup. A planner quietly instructed her team to pause certain activities, her demeanor shifting from festive to procedural. Even the background music, once lively, seemed out of place, too bright for a room that had turned brittle. As the investigation team continued their work, several guests recorded short videos, not with sensational intent, but as documentation of a moment they knew would impact more than the evening's festivities. The Cole name had always been associated with stability and glamour. Now, both were slipping beneath the surface of accusations supported by digital ink. Nothing loud needed to happen for the event to fracture. The silence alone carried enough force. The polished exterior of the celebration no longer held, replaced by the unmistakable realization that the truth had entered the room long before anyone was prepared to face it. Morning light filtered through the blinds with a muted calm that felt out of place after the previous night. I moved through my apartment with slow, deliberate motions, making coffee not for comfort, but for the clarity that came with the familiar routine. The news cycle had already accelerated. Headlines multiplied across the screen of my phone, each article expanding on the story Alicia had published. Analysts weighed in with sharp assessments, while community members reacted with disbelief or resignation. It was strange to witness the unraveling of a legacy from the quiet of my kitchen, yet I felt no impulse to turn away. As I scrolled, a knock sounded at the door, firm, measured, and unmistakably intentional. My heartbeat steadied rather than quickened. I crossed the living room and opened the door to find three familiar figures arranged in a line, their expressions shaped by a mixture of exhaustion and restrained urgency. Gregory stood slightly forward, his posture rigid. Margaret hovered beside him with careful composure. Brooke remained a step behind, her jaw set in a tight line that revealed everything she refused to say. I stepped aside just enough for them to enter without inviting comfort. They moved into the living room with an unease that clung to the air, choosing spots that kept them close together. Their presence carried the tension of people trying to hold on to something slipping too fast for their grasp. No one spoke at first. Gregory's gaze traced the room, as though searching for a detail that might soften the moment. When he finally looked at me, his eyes held a quiet strain. Margaret folded her hands, steadying herself before releasing a slow breath. Brooke remained motionless, her stare fixed with an intensity that suggested she was weighing every possible outcome. Words appeared gradually, shaped by hesitation and need. They spoke about the disruption to the business, the calls that had come overnight, the sudden freeze in partnerships, the uncertainty pressing at every corner of their professional world. Their sentences blended into one another with the tone of people accustomed to managing crises, but unprepared for one rooted so close to home. Beneath their measured phrasing lay a request they didn't name outright. They wanted me to undo what had been set in motion. I listened without interruption, letting their explanations settle into the space between us. Once the silence returned, Brooke stepped forward, the tension in her shoulders sharpening. Her voice carried a controlled edge, shaped by years of authority within the company. She framed the article as an overreach, suggested misunderstandings, implied that internal matters should never have reached public hands. Each point circled the same destination: responsibility belonged elsewhere, and repair required my cooperation. I felt none of the conflict they expected. The distance between us was no longer emotional, it had become structural, built from choices layered over years. Their appeal reached me only as a reminder of what silence had cost. Before I responded, a second knock sounded at the door. Lighter, familiar. When I opened it, Tyler stood there with an expression far removed from the guarded neutrality he often carried. He stepped inside with a quiet resolve, positioning himself in a way that drew a clear line between intention and doubt. His presence shifted the energy of the room instantly, grounding it with a steadiness none of us had anticipated. He spoke to me with a clarity that didn't require raised volume. His words acknowledged what he had known within the company, the irregularities he had seen, the pressure that kept him from speaking earlier. There was no attempt to justify the past, only a recognition of the part he had played by remaining silent. Then, with the same calm assurance, he made his decision clear. He no longer wished to be associated with the business or the culture that shaped its choices. The reaction from the others was immediate yet subdued. Shock that did not reach full expression, disbelief held tight behind controlled faces. Margaret's hands trembled briefly before she steadied them. Gregory's shoulders slumped under a weight he could not mask. Brooke's composure fractured at the edges, though she forced it back into place with visible effort. The room stretched into stillness as the meaning of his decision settled. I felt no triumph, only a quiet affirmation that the truth carried its own momentum once spoken. When I finally addressed them, my voice remained steady. I made it clear that the path ahead was no longer mine to shape on their behalf, and that responsibility rested where it belonged. They left in silence, carrying with them the realization that the foundation they had relied on was no longer intact. The door closed softly behind them, leaving the apartment wrapped in an unusual calm, a calm shaped not by resolution, but by the clarity of distance newly defined. Weeks passed, and the pace of events grew steadier, as though the initial shock had finally settled into something everyone could no longer look away from. 6 months after the investigation began, the consequences had taken shape with a clarity that left no room for speculation. Cole Event Group, once a polished emblem of celebration and prestige, had been forced to scale back operations. Contracts with city partners were suspended, vendor relationships dissolved, and pending bookings were rerouted elsewhere. Regulatory findings outlined violations in definitive terms, and the penalties that followed reshaped the financial structure of the company. The family name, once used as a guarantee of reliability, now carried hesitation when mentioned in professional circles. Brooke Cole stepped down from her role soon after. There was no dramatic announcement, just a notice circulated quietly among industry contacts, acknowledging her exit from day-to-day responsibilities. The rumblings within the company suggested that the decision had not been optional. The demands of leadership had collided with the realities exposed by the investigation, leaving little room for the authority she once held. Gregory and Margaret Cole faced outcomes that cut beyond reputation. Financial settlements required the sale of several assets, including one of their more prominent venues. Their circle of influence contracted noticeably, no longer buoyed by the confidence they once projected so effortlessly. They navigated their days with a subdued composure shaped by the weight of accountability, rather than the comfort of status. Monica Alvarez emerged as a key figure during the regulatory review. Her cooperation provided clarity where documentation had been obscured, allowing investigators to trace the path of decisions that had shaped the company's internal culture. Her testimony did not come from spite. It came from a commitment to integrity that had long been overshadowed by loyalty to her position. In many ways, her courage marked a turning point for others who had felt the pressure of silence within the organization. During these months, I focused on my own work with a clarity that felt unfamiliar, but steadying. The accounting practice I had once nurtured in quiet determination now grew through referrals from clients who valued transparency and diligence. I expanded my services, hired additional support, and found myself building something resilient, not because it carried a family legacy, but because it reflected choices I could stand behind without apology. My world was no longer shaped by proximity to the coal name. It was defined by the purpose I found in work that aligned with my values, and by the calm that accompanied that alignment. Yet closure of any kind rarely arrives through distance alone. One evening, as I was reviewing quarterly reports, my phone vibrated with a message from Margaret. It was brief, carrying none of the polished wording she often used. She asked to meet. Nothing more. I considered declining, but something quiet within urged me not to. So I agreed. We met at a small park near my office. Gregory and Brooke were with her, each carrying an expression shaped less by defensiveness and more by fatigue. The three of them approached with measured steps, their presence subdued, their posture lacking the certainty they once displayed so naturally. Their words did not come as a unified speech. Instead, they emerged in fragments, acknowledgments of harm, recognition of patterns that had gone unchallenged, and a willingness to face the losses as consequences rather than misfortune. No justification, no attempt to rewrite the past. Just an admission of failure that felt long overdue. I listened, not to absolve them, but to understand the sincerity of their intent. For the first time, the distance between us felt bridged not by expectation, but by honesty. When I finally responded, my voice carried the steadiness I had earned through months of reflection. I told them I accepted their apology, but that acceptance did not erase the boundaries I now held. Forgiveness, for me, was an act of release, not an invitation to return to the roles we once occupied. We parted without ceremony, each of us stepping into a future shaped by our choices. As I walked back toward my office, I realized that the real shift in this story had not come from the collapse of a business or the unveiling of hidden truths. It had come from recognizing that loyalty without respect is not loyalty at all, and that stepping away can be an act of courage rather than abandonment. If you followed this journey to the end, thank you for listening. I hope my story reminds you that worth is not measured by the approval of those who fail to see you clearly, and that choosing yourself is not selfish, but necessary. If you'd like to hear more stories like this, stay connected. Your time here means more than you know.